Imagine living 100 years ago when the fastest thing on wheels looked like this. Cars and bikes were still a novelty. So if you wanted to go anywhere, you went by train or walked. The train could travel in a couple of hours as far as a person could walk in a week. Not surprisingly, the world of the Victorians was turned upside down by this new mobility, and the engine driver became a respected figure in society. He was somewhere between scientist and magician, so every little boy wanted to be one. But would rapid travel make the world a finer place? Did the human race have a clue where it was heading? Only time will tell. A 100 years later, the last place you'd expect to see steam engines is on the London Underground. But you'd be wrong. Tucked away on the Metropolitan line is a survivor from the 19th century. In fact, until just a couple of years ago, steam specials regularly ran among the tube trains. 100 years ago, the Metropolitan line was already electrified. Not much has changed on the railways since then, except us. Our clothes are obviously different. But it's our lifestyle that was really changed by the railways. In those days, Harrow was a pleasant country village. People realized they could live here in the countryside, but work in the city. So the line from Baker Street grew longer and longer, with tube trains at the London end and steam trains out in the sticks. The age of the commuter had arrived, and so had suburbia. Net curtains and privet hedges took over the home counties. As recently as 1999, steam engines, like this one from the Watercress line in Hampshire, were still pounding up and down the Metropolitan line on gala days as a reminder of the great railway age. But now we can go one better. After years of work, the Bluebell Railway has restored a complete Victorian train. The carriages come from the Metropolitan line. The engine was built at Brighton. If there's one machine which carried mankind through the Industrial Revolution and into the modern world, this is it.
Well, the carriages we used on the Metropolitan Railway into Baker Street Station, London, and they would have been the sort of tip-top commuter train of the time, state-of-the-art, if you like, to use a modern phrase. And if you cast your mind back to those times, there were very few motor cars on the road. So using the railway was the natural thing to do, and this was the kind of the mode of travel that, you know, people would have used who were, if you like, at the top of their profession and going to London to do the, you know, the pucker job sort of thing.
But how did little engines like this survive for so long? They'd be able to tell you the answer to that in almost any pub on Hayling Island in Hampshire. There was a branch line called the Hayling Billy, which brought holidaymakers across a bridge from the mainland. Since it closed, pubs like the West Town have never been quite the same. There's even a newish pub named after the Hayling Billy. Those little Victorian engines were the only machines light enough for the rickety wooden bridge. You can still see where the bridge was, and locals swear they can still see ghost trains. The engines looked like something out of the Keystone Cops. Bystanders would burst out laughing at the sight. But they were good engines, always known as Terriers, and most of the Hayling Terrier fleet survives.
Well, I think really it's just that they were so useful. Some branch lines, like the Hayling Island line, of course, had a weight limit, and the locomotives were needed to be small enough to operate the train service. But they were used in all sorts of areas, shunting and station pilots, and it even had one in Brighton Works that was a pilot there for years. Just useful, nice little engines.
This one spent years and years toddling about in the docks at Newhaven, before being pressed into duty at Hayling until the axe fell in 1963. By then, railwaymen were rallying round to save them. Tony Deller was an apprentice at the Eastleigh Railway Works when he first met a terrier called Stepney, and 40 years later still works on her.
There were a whole group of us apprentices who were keen to help, and we got permission to take time out of the piecework system and go and do work for free on this loco. We also acquired a number of spare parts which were secreted in various places within the boiler and the side tanks and the smoke box, and generally spent about 3 or 4 days working on it, getting it in a fit state for it to depart and come to the Bluebell, where it of course went virtually straight into service on the Bluebell Railway.
It's the engines that get all the attention. Stepney the Bluebell engine is immortalised in the Thomas the Tank Engine books. But the work of restoring carriages is equally important. And there are more than 100 coaches and wagons on the Bluebell, all needing loving care from the volunteers. It's an endless task.
I should think there are in the region of about 50 carriages and probably slightly more wagons actually. There's only ever a proportion of the vehicles in traffic at any one time. We could never achieve getting everything serviceable at the same time, because obviously it's like the Forth Bridge. You start one end and by the time you've got the other end, the bit that you did first needs doing again. But we like to try and present the carriages in logical sets, carriages that were designed by the same man or from the same period, and obviously in a complementary livery so they all sort of match. That's the idea, and if we can match those sets to the period and type of the engine as well, so much the better.
The results of all the hard work speak for themselves. But behind the paint and polish, there's another story, and it's a heartbreaker. Some of the coaches and locomotives have already been waiting half a century to come in from the cold, and nature is unkind to old engines. Gradually, though, they reach the head of the queue for help, and they come inside to be restored. The railway people never give up. Their patience is endless.
It would be easy to be drawn down into a spiral of despair with the amount of work that remains to be done. But it's not a journey where you ever expect to end. All you can do is try and take bigger strides on the journey, if you see what I mean. But it doesn't have an end, and it would be sad if it did, really, because it's any pursuit where you've got some sort of perpetuality to it keeps its interest. Whereas if it was something that you knew you were going to finish and that's it, you just stand back and look at it, it wouldn't have the same appeal, I don't think.
With the Victorian train now running again, the people at the Bluebell turned their minds to another ambitious scheme. a grand birthday party. They wanted to stage one of the most unusual get-togethers in history, with a short but illustrious list of guests. It's Stepney's birthday. But what do you do for someone who's reached the grand old age of 125? One answer is to invite all the surviving relatives to come and stay, so they can relive old times and let off a bit of steam. The people who look after Stepney decided to contact the owners of the other surviving terriers to see if it was logistically possible to bring them together. They might even have enough puff to keep the Bluebell line running for a weekend or so, though it would take a pair of terriers to pull the heavier trains. Invitations went out, and a few weeks later, the Isle of Wight car ferry was carrying some unusual cargo when it docked at Portsmouth. The first of the birthday guests was arriving. That tiny terrier didn't look so small now. At nearly 30 tons, they're a handful by road. In spite of their quaint looks, engineers swear by them.
They're marvellous little bits of engineering. The materials are slightly substandard in the sense they're made out of wrought iron instead of modern steels. But bear in mind, those terriers were made when there was no motor cars. Horse and cart was the main modes of transport apart from the railways, and so they were the Concorde of their day, really. But they're beautiful things, made like a watch. And these days, of course, we try and make them as authentic as we possibly can on rebuilding them.
Engine number 11, named after Newport on the Isle of Wight, was soon scurrying in the Chichester direction on the A27. Passing Hayling Island on the way. It used to come along here by rail to its home at the Fratton steamshed in Portsmouth. Another invitation went to Tenterden in Kent. Engine number 2678 works on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. Could she be spared for a few days? And then there was Freshwater, number 8, another of the engines that work on the glorious Isle of Wight Steam Railway, which is arguably one of the most beautiful lines in Britain. The answer came back. They'd be delighted to send her to the party. There'd be 5 of the little engines in all, which meant that for once, Stepney wouldn't be overshadowed by lots of larger steam locomotives. But to tell the truth, the Bluebell enginemen knew they'd be in for a back-breaking weekend. Terriers are so small that life is far from ideal for the firemen.
The cab is rather small and the fire grate and fire hole rather close to the footplate floor, so if you're used to working on a larger engine, working on these might well prove difficult for some firemen.
The Bluebell line is a lot hillier than Hayling Island, and back in the days of steam, terriers usually pulled just a couple of coaches, so this would be challenging. completely dwarfed by the carriages, they set off to climb the hills. It was Stepney's turn next, but first there was just time to find out what it's like to be the driver of a Victorian steam engine.
Have a quick look around the engine. We've got the braking mechanism here, which actually stops, brakes the train. We've got the regulator, which basically you're opening a valve to let steam into the cylinders to make the engine go. The fire is down here under the shelf with the T, which is the important thing. And then over here we've got the pressure gauge, which shows you the steam pressure in the boiler. We'll go for a little ride now, just to see what it's like on the move. I've just put the engine into forward gear. I'll just create the brake. And you can see the brake coming up. And I'll pop the whistle, and off we go. We're actually going down a slope, so I don't need to open the regulator. A lot of people don't like these engines because they're quite, even with only 2 coaches on, it's quite hard work. You've got to keep on top of the job, otherwise you'll run out of steam and everybody takes the mick when you get back here at night. We'll go back up now. Just open the regulator. You can see it's quite stiff. That's it, off we go. That noise was the coal falling down the bunker. Quite often the coal sticks.
Engines like Stepney have so far stood the test of time, but will it be possible to keep them going indefinitely?
Yes, I think so. I mean, fortunately they're quite small, so therefore a new boiler, whilst it's an expensive item, is certainly achievable. At the moment we're just finishing off in the pattern shop new cylinder patterns to be able to cast cylinders. A few years ago that would have thought, people would have thought that was impossible. We've made wheel patterns and had new wheels made, apart from the fact that eventually we may have to change the main frames because they are rule time, and a little bit past their sale-by date perhaps. But yes, we can achieve the rebuilding of these relatively easily.
One thing that can't be rebuilt is the network of branch lines in southern England. Public transport corridors like the Hayling branch are gone forever, leaving just a ghostly reminder of public transport in a bygone age. But now there's a price to pay for throwing the bulk of the railway infrastructure away, leaving places like Hayling Island so dependent on the motorcar. In the year 2001 came news the islanders had been dreading. The Department of Transport planned to remodel the only road bridge to include cycle lanes. And with no alternative route available, the islanders were left high and dry. Traffic chaos would be inevitable. Motorists were being advised to expect long delays. Progress had ground to a halt.
Hayling Island is a good example of that, where to put the railway back is going to be so expensive as to be probably not possible. But there is pressure locally, isn't there, to put a branch line back to Lewes that used to run from Uckfield to Lewes. Whether that will be achieved, well, it remains to be seen, a very interesting thing. But when you think that public transport in this area of the country in Victorian times was vastly better than it is now, progress? No, I don't think so.
In Victorian times, you could travel by train from London to Brighton in less time than you can now. So what's gone wrong? Well, no one would suggest bringing back steam, for these engines are just museum pieces that move. But the latest transport initiative for southern England is revealing. It's for a brand new light railway system for Gosport to relieve road chaos. They're bringing back that most Victorian of vehicles, the tram. What would our ancestors say about reinventing the wheel?
An investigation into a fatal hit-and-run uncovers a dark side to a rural community. Stay with us for A Touch of Frost, coming next.